So
Mm-hmm.
I was looking at brain networks that were involved in sexual arousal, and I was
Mm-hmm.
looking at the difference between men who were paraphilic. So they had multiple paraphilia, so they were very kinky. They had a lot of different when I say, I want to be clear actually, when I talk about paraphilias, I think whatever you're into is perfectly acceptable so long as it's consensual. So
Mm-hmm.
there's no judgment there. But I find it really fun because to me, it's so different. So these men were into all kinds of different sexual preferences. And I looked at their brains compared to men who were not. And I also compared them in the context of those who struggled with pornography, excessive sexual behaviors, and trying to understand what does their brain look like when they're struggling with that. Is that akin to an addiction?
So with these men that had particular things that turned them on that maybe um, were variant from like the average bear. So when you talk about like a foot fetish, for example, like I feel like that's one of the most common ones that I see, at least on social media, and everyone's like talking about. So when you look at something like that, well, first, did you study? Was that a particular area that you've researched with? Was like foot fetishes?
That was a common one. Actually, one very very common one was actually an interest in urine, which
Mm-hmm.
is probably, I'm not sure if that's surprising or not, but
No,
for me
not for
it
me
was
at least.
for me it was surprising because, and the other thing I have to say, because people also don't believe, like I actually don't look at porn in my personal life. So
Hmm.
for my PhD, that was really the first time I was going digging, looking, and I was like, wow, there's a lot, and there's a lot of uh, I don't want to say what it, some of the other ways that you can describe urine play basically. And
Hmm.
I always try to keep it quite family friendly when I talk about this stuff. So yeah, I mean, that was one. Gynandromorphophilia, so that's a sexual preference for transgender women. So I won't talk too much about gender here because we did talk quite a bit about that in the
Hmm.
other
Hmm.
episode that I did with you. But that's another very common one. So a sexual interest in women with penis.
Hmm.
What else is there? BDSM is very common. That was probably the most common. Although I would say BDSM is not the same as masochism and sadism, because BDSM is more, there's a lot of negotiation, boundaries. It's not a true paraphilia, because a true paraphilia is, if you look at something like masochism or sadism, the what's arousing for someone who's masochistic or sadistic. So someone who's masochistic likes being humiliated, and then
Hmm.
someone who's sadistic likes seeing their partner being humiliated or
Hmm.
suffering. And so there's in that comes a lack of consent. So
Hmm.
if someone is going to role play that, then there's obviously a consensual aspect. So again, I think for people who are masochistic or sadistic, it's not a choice. Generally, paraphilias are biologically based, but it's your choice what you do with it. So if a person chooses to act out in a way that's not consensual, then I have a problem, and I think that should be criminal. But
Oh, 100%.
if someone just has those fantasies, it's not their choice to be into what they're into. So I ask that people be less judgmental or not judgmental in those cases.
So, did you find like a link between, I guess, like a healthy paraphilia and a maybe one that maybe stems from like childhood traumas or maybe lack of confidence, like a coping mechanism, if you will? Because I find, at least in my experience and of talking to a lot of men that have like these fetishes, I think there's healthy ones, and then there's ones that are kind of like a little in like a light bulb, like an indicator of like you need to focus somewhere else, to like heal somewhere else. So when you were doing your research, I guess I think the BDSM is a good example. Like I would find that BDSM is like a healthy consensual way to explore sexuality, and then when you start getting more into like the violent type of like true, because I mean you can get into a hole on certain tube sites. um, there's some like truly violent performances or exchanges, and you can't deny that there's a difference there. So I would say like one is healthy and one is maybe stems from like a trauma, a psychological trauma perhaps, and I don't know if you ever like found that.
So coming from the perspective of a true paraphilia is someone's primary sexual preference. So that's
Hmm.
the thing that really excites them. It cannot be changed because it is biological. I do
Okay.
think life experience probably shapes the ways in which or what someone specifically finds sexually appealing, but the fact that they have a paraphilia is laid down in the wiring of their brain very early on.
Oh, interesting.
So So I would say with BDSM, because some people are into BDSM, and there are a whole bunch of different reasons, but I would say the violence aspect. There's probably some antisociality there. There's probably again, it could be sadism. So
Hmm.
if that's someone's primary sexual preference, they for them, not heterosexual. What am I thinking of? Vanilla consensual sex is not going to excite them. So in that case, it's again what their choice of what they choose to do with it, and if they choose to act out on it, there's probably some aspect of antisocial personality disorder. There are probably other factors there, like you said, there may be trauma, but
Hmm.
I think BDSM, because it is so, to me, even BDSM is so common, and it's almost the new vanilla in some ways, because it's so mainstream, and I think most people who are even a little bit sexually adventurous have experimented a bit. So yeah, there's a line there, because definitely there are some people, I would say, I've heard stories of people who will say they're into BDSM, but then they may also go down that path of maybe being violent or non-consensual with their partners, which is very unfortunate. But I think it comes back to more that person's pro-socialness, and because you can have this preference, but it's not an indication of necessarily whether you're going to act out on it or not, or necessarily whether someone has trauma in their background.
So if it's their preferred way of like sexual engagement, so let's go back to like the foot fetish. Um, let's say that person like has to incorporate feet play, otherwise like they can't reach climax. Would you say that that becomes like problematic, or is that just like hardwiring? Like that's just part of like their biology and how they were raised, and something clicked or imprinted early on, and then that's just who they are.
Yeah, they probably had some experience, maybe some positive experience with feet when they were younger, or yeah, feet is such a common one, and I don't think that's necessarily a problem or that it's pathological. It's only pathological if they are going out and interacting with their partners in a non-consensual way, so that they can have their sexual needs met in that way. But I think if men say are or well, it's primarily men. If that's what they're into and they're having difficulty finding partners who are into that, then
Hmm.
that's not necessarily an issue with them, as long as it's a consensual, the way that they're going about asking their partners. I think for anything, it's probably good to have a conversation very early on if you are dating someone, to see where their boundaries are and to not spring anything on them, or also just not make any assumptions in general. I That's my general advice to anyone when it comes to seeing whether you're sexually compatible, because I think there's an assumption in our society that if you love somebody, that you can work through anything sexually, or a lot of couples don't even talk about sex. They just assume
Hmm.
that they'll figure it out. They get married, and I see the effects of that when they've been married for 10, 20 years and they're not having sex because they have very different expectations. So that's a bit of a tangent, but I would say, if you have an unusual sexual interest or preference, I don't think there should be any shame or guilt about it, and just to seek out partners who are happy to indulge you, just as you should be happy to indulge them.